You haven't eaten in 2 days. You know exactly where the herd is. You tracked them yesterday, found the prints, mapped the route in your head, and you were ready. And then it started raining. Not a drizzle, a heavy wind-driven downpour that came sideways and soaked through everything and didn't stop. Not for the afternoon, not overnight, it just kept going. And now you can't hunt. The tracks are gone. The river near camp is climbing. The ground is soft and slick, which means moving fast on rocky terrain risks a twisted ankle. And a twisted ankle, 50,000 years ago, without anyone who can carry you indefinitely, without any treatment that works, is a death sentence delivered in slow motion. And then there's the fire. The one thing between you and hypothermia, between you and whatever is prowling outside in the rain, is sitting under a rock overhang and slowly losing the fight. This is what rain actually meant. Not cozy, not a good excuse to stay in bed, not white noise. Rain was a crisis, a compressing, multi-front active emergency that tested every skill a group had and separated the ones who survived from the ones who didn't. Today when it rains, you close the window, put the kettle on, maybe feel vaguely productive because you sorted one drawer. For a human 50,000 years ago, that same rain, that exact sound you fall asleep to with your phone on your chest, had multiple options for how to kill you before it stopped. So what did ancient humans actually do during those long, wet, trapped hours? The answer is more structured, more impressive, and more genuinely surprising than almost anyone expects. And it tells us something important about how we became the species we are. Let's start with the cold, because cold is the first thing that comes for you. A wet human loses body heat up to 25 times faster than a dry one. Without waterproof clothing, without insulated shelter, a sustained rainstorm in temperatures below about 50 degrees Fahrenheit pushes your core temperature into hypothermia range within hours. And here's something people forget about our ancestors. Most of them were not living in permanent tropical warmth. Even in Africa, high elevation sites get genuinely cold at night. Europe during the Upper Paleolithic was colder and wetter than it is now by a significant margin. This wasn't marginal discomfort. It was a physiological threat that killed healthy adults and killed children faster. Cold wasn't weather. It was an opponent. And then there was flooding. Caves and rock shelters were the primary long-term residences for early humans for hundreds of thousands of years. And caves have a geographic problem. They form at the base of hillsides and near rivers, which is exactly where water goes during heavy rain. Archaeologists excavating occupied cave sites have found flood sediment layers, thick deposits of silt, laid down while people were actively living there. Some of those layers are followed by silence. The site was abandoned and never used again after the flood came through. Whatever happened in that event, nobody went back. And then there were the predators. Rain drove large cats, hyenas, and bears into shelter too. Sometimes that shelter was the same cave you were in. South African sites exist where human boas, Ness and leopard bones appear in the same layers. Some of those human skulls have puncture marks that match leopard canine teeth with uncomfortable precision. So rain didn't just make things wet. It compressed the entire world into the same small dry spaces. In the middle of all that compression, one priority overrode everything else. Keep the fire going. The fire wasn't a comfort feature. It was warmth, which meant survival from hypothermia. It was light, which meant you could see what entered the cave with you. It was protection, because predators genuinely avoid fire, a behavioral fact burned into animal cognition through enough bad experiences that it operates almost like instinct now. It was cooked food, which matters enormously because cooking unlocks caloric availability in meat and plant material in ways that raw consumption simply doesn't. Losing the fire wasn't careless. It was potentially fatal for everyone in the group simultaneously. Now, here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Before roughly 40,000 years ago, the evidence for humans reliably creating fire from scratch is thin. We have evidence of controlled fire use going back 400,000 years at Chauvet Cave in Israel and possibly 1,000,000 years at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. But controlling a fire that already exists and generating one from nothing are completely different skills. And the record suggests the second skill arrived significantly later and spread unevenly across populations. Which means for enormous stretches of prehistory, if your fire went out in the rain, you were in serious trouble. You couldn't reach for the lighter. You might not be able to restart it at all. Some groups solve this by carrying fire, literally transporting smoldering coals wrapped in green leaves or packed inside chunks of tinder fungus, a woody bracket fungus that holds a spark internally and smolders for hours without erupting into flame. It's a biological ember container. And we know this wasn't speculation. When archaeologists found Otzi the Iceman, the 5,300-year-old man preserved in an alpine glacier, he was carrying a complete fire kit. Tinder fungus, flint, iron pyrite for striking sparks, Backup plant material. 5,000 years ago, someone who presumably grew up making fire understood that losing it was serious enough to carry dedicated insurance at all times. That says something. When rain hit, the fire came first. Move it deeper into the cave, away from the entrance where wind-driven rain blows in sideways. Shield it with hides or brush. Feed it carefully, because overloading a struggling fire smothers it faster than neglect does. Find dead lower branches on coniferous trees, the ones the canopy above protected, still dry underneath. Split wet logs open to reach the interior wood that rain hasn't penetrated. Use birch bark as emergency kindling, because birch contains a compound called betulin that behaves chemically close enough to pitch that it will burn even wet. One person in a group of 15 might spend an entire rainstorm doing nothing else. Just sitting next to that fire, feeding it, watching it, making sure it didn't die. That was their entire contribution for 2 days, and it was not a small contribution. All right, fire is alive. You're mostly dry. You cannot leave. Now what? The archaeological record is remarkably clear on this point. You make things. Caves and rock shelters from across the prehistoric world are packed with manufacturing evidence. Stone tool debris concentrated in specific spots near where a fire would have been, exactly where someone would sit in the light and work for hours. These concentrations are not random. The flaking debris, the tiny chips that fly off when you're shaping a core into a point, is found in discrete workshops within the cave. Someone sat in one particular spot, repeatedly, across multiple occupations of the same site, and did focused precision work by firelight. The rain outside was irrelevant to what was happening inside. But it wasn't just stone tools. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists uncovered a 100,000-year-old ochre processing workshop. Abalone shells used as mixing bowls, ochre ground to fine powder on grinding stones, bone tools for stirring and applying the resulting pigment. This was not improvised. This was production. Someone developed a system, gathered specific materials, and manufactured something with deliberate method. You don't do this while running. You do this when you're stuck inside with hours to fill and light to work by. The rain outside created the conditions. The cave provided the space. And the result was something that didn't exist in the world before that person made it. And then there are the needles. Bone needles appear in the record around 61,000 years ago, in South Africa, and later across Europe and Asia. Small, delicate, precisely shaped with drilled eyes fine enough to thread animal sinew through. Making one requires sustained attention, fine motor control, and enough uninterrupted time to ruin a dozen attempts before you get it right. You don't carve a bone needle in 10 minutes between other tasks. You sit down, you commit, and you work through the process slowly. And what bone needles represent is not just a tool type. They represent sewn clothing, fitted, stitched hides that actually keep water out and heat in. If you have needles, you can make functional cold weather gear, which is part of why anatomically modern humans survived environments that pushed Neanderthals to their limits. Not necessarily bigger brains, better reindeer. Now, here's something that catches people genuinely off guard. A Neanderthal site called Abri du Maris in France produced a tiny fragment of twisted plant fiber cord dating to roughly 52,000 years ago. That is the oldest direct evidence of string ever found. And string is one of the most consequential technologies in human history. String lets you tie things together. String means better shelters. It means snares and traps that catch animals while you sleep, which is hunting without being present. It means hafted tools, stone points bound tightly to wooden handles, which are dramatically more effective than a stone gripped in a bare hand. An enormous proportion of everything humans built for the next 50,000 years depended on string. And the oldest string ever found came from someone sitting in a rock shelter with nothing pressing to do. At Hohlefels Cave in Germany, archaeologists found something that makes this even more explicit. A 35,000-year-old tool carved from mammoth ivory with 4 holes and precisely cut spiral grooves, designed specifically for twisting plant fibers into rope. Someone carved a dedicated rope-making machine out of ivory. Ivory is not easy to work. This took time and planning and real skill, and it was carved not to do something immediate, but to make a subsequent process faster and more consistent. That is engineering. That is someone understanding a problem well enough to design a specialized solution and then executing it with high-quality materials. That kind of thinking almost certainly happened during exactly the kind of long, weather-forced indoor downtime we're talking about. But let's talk about the bedding, because this one consistently surprises people. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, evidence from 77,000 years ago shows deliberately constructed sleeping surfaces, layers of sedge, rush, and grass arranged as mats. And the top layers included leaves from the broad-leaved camphor bush, a plant with documented insect-repelling chemical properties. Someone 77,000 years ago was not just finding somewhere flat to sleep, they were sleeping comfortably, by design, with active pest management. And the bedding was periodically burned and replaced to keep the surface fresh and clean. This is not survival thinking. This is comfort thinking. The gap between those two modes is important, because improving your situation beyond the minimum required for survival requires imagining a better version of that situation and then working toward it deliberately. That kind of thinking is the foundation of everything that came after. Here's where the story turns completely. Because all of that, the tools, the rope, the needles, the bedding, that's the practical output. The stuff that keeps a group functional and alive. What happened alongside it is something else entirely. At Chauvet Cave in southern France, paintings survive that are roughly 36,000 years old. Lions mid-sprint, rhinos facing off, bears rendered with an understanding of weight and musculature that still surprises researchers who study animal anatomy professionally. These are not scratches on rock. The artists understood movement. They used the natural contours of the cave wall to add three-dimensionality to the figures. Some of the animals look like they're in the process of turning towards you. The skill involved is not what you'd expect from people who were supposedly focused entirely on day-to-day survival. Chauvet is not alone. Lascaux, Altamira, Sulawesi in Indonesia, where figurative cave art dates to at least 45,000 years ago, making it the oldest known anywhere on the planet. But here's something that gets overlooked in most discussions of this art. These paintings are not near the cave entrances. They're not in the sheltered portions where people actually lived and slept. They're deep, sometimes hundreds of meters in, through narrow passages, in chambers you have to crawl to reach. Someone carried animal fat lamps into absolute darkness and painted. Nobody does that when the weather's clear and the hunting is good and there's firewood to gather. You do that when you've been inside for 2 days and every tool is already sharpened and the fire is stable and there's nothing left to do except go deeper into the dark and make something. Let me throw something at you that doesn't get enough attention. When you force 10 to 30 people into a confined space for days with nowhere to go, something happens to the information held inside that group. It moves. Knowledge that exists in one person's head gets spoken aloud to people who didn't have it before. Skills get demonstrated, and the research on this is striking. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner published a study in 2014 comparing daytime and nighttime conversations among the Juo-Hansi Bushmen of the Kalahari. During the day, conversations centered on practical matters: resources, logistics, disputes. At night, around the fire, more than 80% of the conversation shifted to stories, songs, and communal narrative. The firelight changed what people were willing to share. It softened the social environment in a specific, measurable way. The same dynamic almost certainly operated during extended rain events. When a group is stuck inside and the immediate practical tasks are done, the conversation eventually moves past the immediate. You talk about where the water sources dry up in summer, which plants are toxic and which are medicine, and how to tell the difference from a distance. Where the best flint outcrops are 3 valleys over and 4 days walk east. This is not small talk. This is critical survival knowledge being transferred from the people who have it to the people who will need it. And without writing, without records of any kind, this direct verbal transmission was the only mechanism by which any of it survived. You didn't look it up. You remembered it because someone told it to you. Probably more than once. Probably with emphasis on the consequences of forgetting. And then beyond practical knowledge, there were stories. Every culture on Earth, without exception, has rain mythology. Stories about where rain comes from, what controls it, what it means, what happens when it doesn't arrive. Someone invented every one of those stories. And the overwhelmingly plausible scenario is that they invented them while sitting in exactly the situation the story was trying to explain. Rain hammering outside, fire inside, a group of people with nothing to do and an enormous, unanswerable question right in front of them. Why is this happening? When does it stop? What if it doesn't? Those questions don't have practical answers available to a hunter-gatherer in 50,000 BC. So people built narrative answers. And those narrative answers, told and retold, became the foundations of culture. The oldest verified oral traditions in the world demonstrate just how durable that storytelling actually is. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions describing coastal geography have been matched against geological evidence of sea level changes that occurred approximately 7,000 years ago. Stories that accurately preserved real geographic information for 7,000 years through nothing but people telling them to each other across hundreds of generations. That kind of durability doesn't emerge accidentally. It requires deliberate, repeated, treated as important transmission. Rainy days were not dead time. They were transmission time. The hours when everything the group knew got moved from the people who held it to the people who would carry it forward. Now, here's the part nobody expects. Rain wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes it was the best possible thing that could happen. After a heavy rain, the ground is soft. Soft ground means tracks. Deep, clear, detailed impressions that tell you exactly which animals passed, how recently, how fast, and in which direction. Some of the best tracking conditions in the world occur in the hours immediately after rain stops. A group that spent 2 days inside making tools and rope and sharpening everything they owned walked outside after the storm into a world that was practically narrating itself to them. The rain had made the next hunt easier, not harder. Rain also meant water directly. Rock depressions that filled during rainfall are found near almost every known prehistoric campsite, and some show signs of deliberate modification, carved deeper to hold greater volume. And rain changed the food landscape in ways that experienced groups knew how to read. Mushrooms emerge after rain. Tubers pull free from loosened wet soil with far less effort. Insects surface. Termites swarm after rainfall in tropical Africa in protein-dense quantities that require no weapons and no hunting skill whatsoever. You just pick them up. Chimpanzees gorge on termite swarms after rain today. Early humans almost certainly did the same, probably with deliberateness and coordination that chimpanzees don't approach. The food supply didn't stop during rain, it transformed. And the groups that understood that transformation had an advantage over the ones that didn't. So what did ancient humans do when it rained all day? Everything that mattered. They kept the most critical technology they had alive and burning. They made the tools that would go into the next hunt, better than the ones that came out of the last one. They sewed clothing that would keep people alive through the cold months ahead. They twisted rope that held shelters together and made traps possible. They ground pigment for purposes that ranged from tool adhesives to body decoration to whatever was happening deep in those painted chambers in the dark. They told each other things that couldn't afford to be forgotten. They built the informational architecture that kept the group functional across seasons and across generations. None of that was wasted time. And when the rain finally stopped, they walked outside into soft ground covered in clear animal tracks, with mushrooms already pushing through the leaf litter and the river beginning to drop and the fire banked and ready to bring up again. Every person in that group, slightly better equipped than they'd been 2 days before. A new tool finished and ready. A technique practiced until it held together properly. A piece of knowledge heard for the first time and committed to memory. Rain didn't interrupt the work. It redirected it toward the work that couldn't get done any other way. The needles and the rope and the art and the stories weren't made on the good days when everything was working. They were made in the dark, while rain came down outside, by people with hours to fill and firelight to see by. That's where most of it came from.